Our next guest speaker is Mimi McFaul, Director of Digital Initiatives for the National Mental Health Innovation Center, and that's located at the Anschutz campus here in Denver. And so Mimi is a clinical psychologist who traces her way to the Digital Initiatives Mental Health Innovation Center via a winding career path in correctional institutions, behavioral health systems improvement, and a mental health technology startup here at CSU. She most recently served as Vice President of Campus Partnerships at Grit Digital Health, creating a mental health fitness center for college students from concept to product. She also served for more than 10 years as the Director of Mental Health at the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education. Mimi is a graduate of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and the California School of Professional Psychology, San Francisco. She completed her pre- and post-doctoral training at the University of Colorado, Denver, and she joined NMHIC because of her frustration with our current mental health care system. I talked to her previously about that, and she's got incredible ideas for what mental health is and how she can help the entire community. Please help me in welcoming her.
All right, good afternoon. So I just think the variety of the people you've heard today shows the interesting kind of emerging space that VR is. As a clinical psychologist, did I ever imagine being kind of a technologist and building kind of what real-world solutions could be created with the end users and ultimately testing them in the community? There's no way I would have put money on that. But you can see across journalism, architecture, big corporate industry, a CEO, there's a content developer and a mental health practitioner by training. That is just a glimpse into really how many opportunities there are in VR at this point. So I'm going to skip a lot of slides, probably. There is a number of things I thought were really interesting that it helped to actually hear from a different perspective, but things that we have come to understand through our kind of exploration of VR and what it's used for, but came to the same either resolution or actually there was a problem across our fields that actually was in tandem. So that even when you're citing paper and pencil, kind of that the traces in your field of that still being real, that is very much the case in healthcare and mental health care. Even up until the last 10 years when we actually automated kind of health records and those kinds of things that you would have thought we would have done a long time ago. So in our sector, health and mental health, things usually move very slowly. And so some of what we're focused on is trying to kind of understand the empirical evidence of a particular technology solution, but also decrease kind of the slow or dinosaur kind of pace with which we usually move sometimes in terms of kind of academic research coming out into the real world. So our focus is really real world implementation. We spent a year of exploration in a number of different areas, and the convergence around focusing on technology and mental health in particular in VR happened in an interesting way. And we finally ran into Walter Greenleaf at Stanford and went to their human interaction lab. Everyone has a first-time VR experience and really understood the power of, understanding, doing the demo and really experiencing it. There was no way cognitively I could explain kind of what that process was doing and how it allowed me to be more immersed and learn better and faster. And so then the idea is to try to find how can we understand use cases across our field and really what are the barriers to commercial scale. So I'm going to go through these really quickly because if you're here, you probably already know this, but there's a convergence of factors that even make it possible for us to talk about what we've learned for the last several years. here, and the hardware costs are one of those factors. You probably saw at during the Olympics this last year. You're seeing lots of and around the holidays last year, lots of commercials for getting the hands of kind of VR headsets in the hands of the public, and that was new. There wasn't a lot of talk about that, about what kind of research or how it's being used for kind of rehabilitative or medical uses, which is our focus. But the investment in digital technology in healthcare is outstanding right now and continues to grow. And then there just seems to be a readiness across a number of different fields. Mental health in particular, I wasn't expecting the interest or the willingness to kind of jump into this with us without us having an understanding of what we could tell them it would result in. And there was a hunger for that. So there's something about that. If traditional kind of mental health clinics and other community sites are wanting to kind of dig into this with us. So there's something about readiness there that drove us. Whoa. So this, I just wanted to show you you can see the price point for the headsets has gone down. That's already outdated. But this, I think, is particularly interesting just about the predicted market size of VR and AR. And you can see that in the enterprise and public sector, healthcare is one of the biggest chunks. We'll see if that, I have some doubts about what might get in the way, but that's at least exciting for now. This is when we talk to VR experts that have been in this for a long time, and they said, well, this is kind of like the second coming of VR. This was predicted about 10 years ago, and you weren't around then, or you weren't in the field then, but we all thought it was going to happen then, and it didn't. And so they're like, what is different about now that is going to account for that kind of convergence into the field? A number of things I think are in place to make it different now. Especially the number of people and from different disciplines coming into the field, but I guess maybe the answer is maybe. There's a lot of factors that need to occur. So this is just an example of some of this. So someone said this will change the world. This was in 2002. It's going to be bigger than the PC, bigger than the internet, fastest company to ever hit 1 billion. What the car was to the horse and buggy, and what do you guess that was? It was the Segway. I have never had someone guess that, but of course, you're like one of the speakers. So yeah, that's awesome. So it was the Segway, and obviously we know what happened to the Segway. So I think the thing that's most interesting right now is we know, at least the technologists and computer scientists and computer engineers know kind of what the form in terms of kind of the technology, what frame rates, what are we looking at for kind of optimal experiences inside the headset. We know that, or we know what it needs to get better. That's not unclear at this point. The function in terms of how it will be applied across different industries, I think, is the part that we're all grappling with, and we can easily, I think, take that attention from on those kind of those functions to think about then where does that intersect with problems that we have in healthcare or mental health in particular that are scalable or that impact and have the most relevance to the most people. And so I think that's the zone that if we're really going to see it cross over, we've got to figure out how what we know VR does well crosses over into solving a problem at a point in time, at a point in need in clinical care, for example. So I don't know if this is a really bad analogy or not, but I had one Leatherman, and it was like I got my car broken into one time in my life, and the Leatherman was stolen, and I've never gotten another one, and I've always yearned for one. But I kept trying to I cannot think of any other tool analogy right now other than we know there's a number of kind of offshoots of what kind of VR can do in terms of function. You heard a number of things today from different perspectives, and so that's, if we really think about VR as a tool and start getting people's perception of it around that idea, and that it's pulled in when and if we need it, which is different than which you'll see, basically gaming and porn, which is you could stay in for as long as you want, or the intent is to kind of stay there for an extended amount of time, if you will. That's a little bit overgeneralized, but you get my point. So in the way we're thinking about it, it's to solve a particular issue that we can't do as well in real life. That's all it is. And so it doesn't supplant. There's a lot of fear in kind of healthcare, or people think that if we're in technology and mental health, that we want to replace the kind of the human parts of our field that we know are very supportive in therapeutic. That is absolutely not the case. However, we've been talking about the same problems in our system, especially mental health, for 40 years. Same things over and over and over and over. And while those things are absolutely true and impact people's lives every day, we've got to think about how we can help create the solutions. And never did I think that there would be a day that we'd be doing that in concert with other technology companies and other industries that help us think about the problem better than we can. So we'll see if the Leatherman analogy just sticks here over time. But so think about, I think the easiest way that we tell people to think about what are the best uses or functions for VR. We already know what it lends itself to doing well. So things that are not possible in the real world, and I'll give you a couple examples. Anytime, especially in our field, where we say, imagine this, anything imaginal, anything that's role play. How many people honestly love role play? I know you're not going to. I know it, right? No one loves it. Everyone hates it. And yes, it's a part of how we teach and how we're supposed to learn. It falls flat quite frequently. So skill development, really, if we think about kind of aviation and surgical training, I mean, they've had this, embedded in their fields for a long time. So we use that same concept of what skills do we need to actually teach in a given environment and break them down in a virtual world. Same concept. And anywhere you need rehearsal. So when I went to graduate school and we had to practice, that was back we had VHS tapes where we had to video ourselves with interviewing clients and patients. And I mean, just even saying that, the inefficiencies in that, and I quite frankly don't even know if it converted to any competence. But I could only do it a few times, and there weren't a lot of variables that were changed. And I didn't have anyone kind of actually monitoring, some kind of supervisory kind of figure, or some kind of teacher, faculty member, kind of or peer or practicum mentor in the field, actually manipulating kind of what my learning environment was like to test me. Nor could I see the results of any of those practice behaviors. All of that can be done better in VR. The things I talk about, things not possible in the real world. I loved, Michael, your how you talked about transportation versus, I've never thought about it that way, because sometimes I think I use the wrong word when I think about having people say, how do we, if there's any notion that we need to get someone transported to somewhere else because they are place-bound or captive or unable to move because of they're going through a medical treatment, or they're in an inpatient psychiatric hospital, or they're incarcerated in a corrections facility. Anywhere where your kind of degree of freedom is compromised, I think about VR potentially being helpful and around kind of distraction, basically, in those moments. And they're for very specific reasons. We don't just want to take people out of reality just because. There has to be a reason, and I'll get to a couple of those big ones. So when I talk about mental health, I appreciated the question from you guys about what's my definition of mental health. It's very broad. Our whole center, really is trying to think about mental health all the way from how you got up in the morning this morning and how those patterns of your mood happen every day for all of you in here. So I'm not talking about another group or some group with some other kind of serious diagnosis. I'm talking about every single one of us. How do we deal with emotion regulation? What's our emotional intelligence? Call it whatever you want. Resilience, coping skills at this end, and then serious mental health issues on the other end. And so part of our mission is to until we really shift how people that if people do not believe that mental health is relevant to them, we are going to stay a specialty sector in the way that we have been. I do think that's changing with the help of other fields like public health, and us changing our frame on how we can attack these things and outside of a individual diagnostic viewpoint, but we still have a ways to go. And so we're really trying to think about when we first started looking at the research basically around mental health and virtual reality, we found a lot of great evidence around particular conditions. And while I think that's great, that's why we got into it. There was already a baseline of support for this in mental health, which is usually not the case in our field. We were surprised about it. I hadn't seen any of the research over those 30 years. And so when we read it all and understand where those clusters happen, that was a good jumping off point, but it had us broaden even how we thought about utility in a clinical or supportive way, meaning that anyone, so take phobias, for example, which is one of the things that VR is particularly good at treating clinically. Very good. Don't have to replicate going to the airport, which my dad as a clinical psychologist used to do, would take people to a hangar in Peoria, Illinois, and actually walk people through this kind of hierarchical ladder that you do in exposure therapy to expose people to fears. And basically it's very effective, right? But how reproducible is that, or how efficient or effective? Not very much at all. How many people actually, suffer from something that's a phobia that is debilitating? Well, that may be overall small, but if we then expand our notion of fear and anxiety in general, we all have fears of something. I mean, getting up here speaking is a good example. That I don't have a debilitating. I'm here. I'm doing it. I may be stumbling over my words and shaking, but I'm up here. And so, but could I do it? Could I practice and do it better? To be able to tell stories like you do, I could use VR to do that. And so then you really have to think about, expand your notion of anxiety and fear to think about use cases, in my opinion. Where's the counter? Oh boy. All right. So lots of research. We have all the articles if you're ever interested in a particular condition. That's Skip Rizzo, right, one of our colleagues at USC, who has a research lab, but also has his own internal development capacity in his research lab. So I talked about this a little bit. Exposure therapy for phobia is very, very effective. This is kind of where I'd say most of the content for clinical purposes is focused right now, which is good because we have research to back it up. We just also need to simultaneously think about training the workforce of tomorrow, how to kind of basically really practical information about how and when to utilize tools like this for particular conditions. That's kind of the next era. This is an example, one shot from Skip Rizzo's Brave Mind program. Basically, very effective for combat vets that were not responsive to traditional PTSD treatment. And quite frankly, engaging a population that wasn't traditionally coming in to seek care until there was a crisis. So we all also think about VR as an engagement tool, even if you're not necessarily providing a clinical intervention with it per se. And the one on the right, this is funny because this is where we started. This is Dr. Joanne DeFidi's work with basically, I'm forgetting term right now, or her program, but Virtual World Trade Center, because she was seeing lots of firefighters come back and again, not being responsive to traditional PTSD treatment, and this is like dinosaurish. Now she showed us the actual kind of what the program looks like, and it's enormous. You know, it's like when you used to see kind of big storage tanks for kind of computer or for data storage. So, but she had very, very good outcomes with it and never had been in VR before. Never. And this got her into, she was a researcher and a clinician, obviously. But because of the outcomes and because she couldn't impact the outcomes and quality of life in traditional ways and saw that this worked, she became an advocate for it. Addiction recovery, so practicing, so thinking about getting out of addiction treatment services and imagining you're at a bar or imagining what that could be like, very difficult to recreate what physiological triggers you have in the body. Acute pain, this is one of the things that got my attention. I mean, this sometimes people would think of this outside of our zone. But I don't think so, because we talk about chronic pain and the psychological implications of that pain and the opioid crisis. But this study, it was absolutely amazing in terms they focused on kids' pediatric burn units. So the most terrifying and painful experience was getting their wounds cleaned. And they did a distraction, basically experience around throwing snowballs, and it was all cold and white. Basically, bottom line, on the second study, their outcomes neared opioid territory in self-reported pain outcomes, like getting up toward 40%, unheard of. And so that is, I mean, that's a use case that, I mean, no one can argue with that. It's just, you know, it's unbelievable, kind of the difference it made. Being used a lot in palliative and hospice care. And we are seeing, I would say the biggest thing we've learned is people's interest in, this is like meditation or mindfulness on training wheels. So if you have your own meditation practice, it's not for you. But it's for a lot of people, they need to be kind of walked through an experience to kind of guide their focus. So it could be used also for relaxation, distraction, focus, those kinds of things. So we're seeing a ton of requests for this across industries, employee, corporate wellness programs, all of it. Very interested in how you can use this. I think the implementation kind of it will be the thing that's, like anything, it's difficult to maintain engagement. We're also doing some work with VR in prisons, and my time is up, so I am going to say one other thing. I think assessment, honestly, and maybe I'll talk about a couple other these things later, but assessment is an area ripe for VR use. And I think as we get better at being able to understand and put questions in and understand and analyze the data on the back end, it's going to get even better, way better than me doing standardized tests, pencil and paper in a room doing a diagnostic battery with someone. Training, so we'll get to that a little bit. What needs to shift? I'm just going to say one other thing. See, I changed this to be the mental health center here, but this is just a joke. But basically, we need to think about how we translate the stories, which has been honestly our biggest issue. I said, if we can tell the stories of what this is doing and how it's going to impact, then we're going to get. Yes, we need the research. We need all of it. But I truly believe that that part of this is storytelling. We change the narrative around how it's perceived right now in gaming and porn. I'm going to stop there, and I will. The next two, I think one person mentioned it about the next frontier in VR. I do believe is the sensor market, attaching what sensors to what headsets to track what activity and physiological changes is probably the next frontier for it to be really helpful in healthcare. Whew, that's it. Thanks, you guys.